From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good evening, and what a wonderful day it's been here at the 15th National Book Festival. I'm Mark Sweeney, the Associate Librarian for Library Services at the Library of Congress, where it's our mission to support the Congress in fulfilling its constitutional duties and to further the progress of knowledge and creativity for the benefit of the American people, we the people. It's my privilege now to introduce our final Fiction Pavilion author today, the distinguished writer, reviewer, and teacher of creative writing, Thomas Mallon. He's a prolific author of 9 books of fiction, which include Henry and Clara from 1994, Bandbox from 2004, Dewey Defeats Truman, a novel, and Watergate, a novel. His latest work, Finale, a novel of the Reagan Years, is making its world debut here today. Woo-hoo. I've already read it, and if you have an interest in American politics, especially those years in the 1980s, you won't be able to put it down. It's also for sale downstairs in the bookshop on the lower level. Thomas is also an adept writer of nonfiction, having covered subjects such as plagiarism in Stolen Words from 1994, in Diaries, a book of one's own in 1984, Letters in Yours Ever, and the Kennedy assassination in Mrs. Paine's Garage and the Murder of John F. Kennedy. He received his doctorate in English and American Literature from Harvard University and has taught at Vassar College and is currently a professor of English at George Washington University here in Washington. Through his work as deputy chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities, he helped launch the Library of Congress's acclaimed Chronicling America historic newspaper website, which now provides 10 million pages of historic newspapers. It's one of our most popular resources, and I'm grateful for all of your work in helping us get it going. So please join me in welcoming a good friend of the Library of Congress who gets the last word today as author of Finale, the novel of the Reagan Years, Tom Mallon.
Thank you. Mark alluded to my brief time in the government about 10 years ago, and was nice enough to associate me with the National Digital Newspaper Program, of which I can assure you I contributed virtually nothing. The program owes its life really to Mark and his colleagues at the library, and to some wonderful colleagues that I had at the NEH. Especially, I'm thinking right now of Helen Aguirre, the wonderful Helen who retired, I believe, recently from NEH. It is, although I had virtually nothing to do with it, it is a wonderful program, and I think there are more than 10 million pages up now. It was almost like a pilot project back in the day when I was at the endowment, and it is a fantastic repository of old American newspapers, some of them of an obscurity you would not believe. We are not talking about big city dailies here. We're talking about all kinds of newspapers, big cities, small cities, and it's an absolute gift to a historical novelist for whom the newspaper is always the first resource available for, I think, just about any subject. I'd also like to thank everybody from the library, especially John Cole, who invited me to the first National Book Festival in 2001, and Maria Rana, whom I've known at both the Post and the library. And anyway, I thought I would talk very informally about this new novel of mine before reading one brief scene in, I assure you, under 10 minutes, and then just taking questions from people about this book, the time it covers, anything at all that's on your mind after a day at the festival. I was last here in 2012 with my previous novel, Watergate. That book might be called, I think, Novelized History. I flipped these terms around. write in an afterword to one of my books that nouns always trump adjectives. Can we still use trump as a verb? I guess so. But the noun is always more important than the adjective. And I think of Watergate as novelized history because all of the main characters in that book were drawn from real life. They were all real historical personages, but there was an overlaying of fiction upon the historical timeline. This new book, this finale, which is set during the second term of the Reagan administration, you might call a historicized novel. Again, the noun trumping the adjective, since there's a greater quotient of fictional elements in it, principally two entirely fictional characters who carry a lot of the story. One of those is a woman named Anne McMurray, who was the heroine of a long ago novel of mine called Dewey Defeats Truman, which was set in 1948 in Owasso, Michigan, the hometown of Thomas E. Dewey, the sure thing Republican candidate for president that year. And in that book, Anne was a 23-year-old bookstore clerk who was being fought over almost as if she were the electorate by a local Republican lawyer and a Democratic union organizer. This was a sort of summary comedy, probably the lightest of all of my novels. The Republican lawyer won out, but 40 years later in finale, I have brought Anne back. She is long since divorced from Peter, as she knew she would be when she accepted his proposal in the 40s. And she is a youthful grandmother living on her own in Arlington, and she is now an anti-nuclear activist working with Dr. Helen Caldicott against the Reagan defense buildup. She's gone from being an ingenue to being, sort of the little old lady in tennis shoes, as they used to say about older activists. Let me say a word about the state of public affairs in 1986, which is almost too recent to be historical fiction, but it is a good 30 years ago. That year brought President Reagan to the low point in his political fortunes, 2 years after he'd won his landslide re-election over Walter Mondale. The administration seemed to be out of gas and not very alert to a wave of new social ills, from crack to AIDS to homelessness. The Democrats were making what would be a successful push to recapture the Senate, and by the end of the year, the Iran-Contra scandal had broken open, sparking talk of the president's impeachment. But the administration was still pursuing an audacious foreign policy, and a large portion of finale concerns the dramatic summit at Reykjavik in October of '86, where the president and Mikhail Gorbachev nearly agreed to the abolition of nuclear weapons, an accord that was, in the end, never reached because of President Reagan's refusal to give up the Strategic Defense Initiative, what was popularly called Star Wars at the time. Today, the significance of the summit is still disputed, but there's a strong school of thought that credits what the president did there with ending the Cold War, forcing the Soviets to go home and spend themselves into a death spiral. People will be arguing about this as long as they argue about World War II, the Cold War, whatever. But you can make a good case for it if you want to. But what counts in the novel really is how at the end of '86, Reagan's performance at the summit was perceived as just another one of his troubles. It was perceived as a fiasco and was associated with this rapid decline in his political fortunes. I always seem to write about these politicians when they're at their lowest points, whether it's Watergate or Iran-Contra, whatever. One other difference, though, between this novel and Watergate involves how, in that earlier book, Richard Nixon is like the other characters seen from the inside out. He's what we call in the creative writing biz a point of view character, whose thoughts and emotions are rendered in what fiction writers call the close third person. It's technically third person, but it's so close to his voice and his thought process that he's almost speaking to you in the first person. It's a very flexible instrument. It's the most common mode, I would say, of narration that exists in fiction in modern times. I don't know what it says about me that in writing Watergate, I never felt uncomfortable slipping in and out of Richard Nixon's skin. But I wasn't working on this new book for more than a few weeks before I realized that I would not be able to do that with Ronald Reagan, a much more mysterious personality, sometimes surprisingly profound and sometimes downright silly, but a man who could seem remote to nearly everyone, even his wife Nancy, who admits as much in her memoirs. So what I did was adopt the approach that Gore Vidal uses in his novel Lincoln. He never lets us see the president from the inside out. We rely instead on a series of competing points of view, other characters who are dealing with Lincoln, and they give us the information and the drama that allows us to make up our minds about the central figure. That approach more or less governs Finale, even though all of the characters around Reagan are meant to be important in and of themselves and to have their own interlocking stories. Some of these characters, just to get at the book through the people in it, aside from Anne McMurray, whom I revived from Dewey Defeats Truman, there's a young man named Anders Little, a fictional National Security Council staffer whose firm belief in the president's policies is being sorely tested, and whose personal life is opening up towards something more honest, just as the AIDS epidemic is going into full swing. And there are the real-life figures who populate most of the book, most of them conveniently now dead. Incidentally, the greatest, from the point of view of a historical novelist, the greatest protection afforded by the American legal system is that you cannot libel the dead. American writers have all sorts of reasons to be grateful that they're not writing in England. That is chief among them, that the legal system here is much more favorable to writers, especially writers of fiction, but reporters as well. Some of these real-life figures. There's Pamela Harriman, or I might say Pamela Digby Churchill Hayward Harriman, the now rich, in the book, much-married widow who has reinvented herself once more, this time as a political activist spearheading the PAC behind the Democrats' effort to capture the Senate. Richard Nixon is back in the book, an elder statesman in search of redemption. Early in the novel, he speaks of Reagan as the luckiest son of a bitch since Coolidge. But in fact, even though Nixon was rather jealous of the ease with which things seemed to come to Reagan for much of his career, sort of up to this point in his presidency, they communicated with friendliness and quite a bit of frequency during Reagan's presidency, and the exchanges were initiated by both of them. Nixon frequently called or wrote a memo to the White House. Reagan frequently called Nixon. Unfortunately, post-Nixon, we don't have taped presidential conversations anymore as source material. But I like to think about one that we know took place in 1984 between Nixon and Reagan before Reagan went to China. You can sort of imagine the strategic guidance that Nixon would have relished giving to this one of his successors. You know, you can imagine him, now Ron, you've got to tell them to float their currency. You've got to tell them to keep 3 divisions on the Manchurian border against the Soviets. Nixon getting down to cases in his geopolitical way. But in Reagan's diary from the China trip that he took, we have only this evidence of the prepping he got from his predecessor. This is from Reagan's diary in '84. And he notes early in the trip, we had our first go at a 12-course Chinese dinner. We heeded Dick Nixon's advice and didn't ask what things were. We just swallowed them. Reagan's diaries are actually enormously interesting. They are charming. They are unself-conscious. They are full of odd little details. And they, too, aside from the newspapers and everyone's memoirs, were an important source. Some people who read this book are probably going to judge its portrait of Nancy Reagan as harsh. But I see it as fundamentally sympathetic, and I hope others will too. The Nancy in Finale is very bright, but she's a kind of raw nerve. She's not enjoying much of anything. She is consumed with tactics and strategy, dependent upon astrology and the comfort provided by a series of telephone friends. She was on the telephone more than anyone since Lyndon Johnson in the White House. And she would admit this about herself, that she was a tremendous worrier. One of the reasons why she was so bone-thin and fashionable. She worried about everything. She never relaxed. One of her pals that we hear a lot of in the book is Merv Griffin, who's usually calling to buck her up and saying something like, "Ooh, great speech." And throughout this novel, Nancy is heading toward what is really a very hard revelation for her about the relationship with the man she very sincerely loves and ferociously protects. And finally, among the main real-life characters, there's the young Christopher Hitchens, my good and very much missed friend. In this novel, he's still in his mid-30s and relatively new to America. He's coming out of his first marriage. He's wondering whether to make his way here in the States or to go back to England. He's beginning to commute between the slick, highly paying pages of Vanity Fair magazine and the more strident, poverty-stricken ones of the nation. He's caught, constantly in the book, he's caught in the middle of things. For much of the book, he's chasing Mrs. Harriman around. He's doing a profile of her for Tina Brown, a piece that is entirely fictional. That never happened. And then he's heading off to cover the Reykjavik summit. He never went there, to do an article for The Nation. So it's the real Hitch having a series of fictional adventures. And in the course of the novel, he becomes involved with just about everyone, all of the main characters, including some of the minor ones, who themselves include Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister. Hitchens had first, in real life, not in fiction, he had met Mrs. Thatcher about a decade earlier when she became leader of the opposition Conservative Party in England. In fact, by a slight bit of background, I thought I would let Hitch himself describe their encounter in a passage from his memoir, Hitch 22, a wonderful book which I urge upon you. This is how he describes meeting Mrs. Thatcher when she was still in the opposition and he was only in his 20s, almost fresh out of Oxford and writing for British weeklies. I felt that she knew my name and perhaps had connected it to the Socialist Weekly, in which I had recently called her rather sexy. While she struggled adorably with this moment of pretty confusion, I felt obliged to seek controversy and picked a fight with her on a detail of Rhodesia-Zimbabwe policy. She took me up on it. I was, as it chances, right on the small point of fact, and she was wrong. But she maintained her wrongness with such adamantine strength that I eventually conceded the point and even bowed slightly to emphasize my acknowledgement. "No," she said, "bow lower." Smiling agreeably, I bent forward a bit farther. "No, no," she trilled, "much lower." By this time, a little group of interested bystanders was gathering. I again bent forward, this time much more self-consciously. Stepping around behind me, she unmasked her batteries and smote me on the rear with the parliamentary order paper that she had been rolling into a cylinder behind her back. I regained vertical with some awkwardness. As she walked away, she looked back over her shoulder and gave an almost imperceptibly slight roll of the hip while mouthing the words, "Naughty boy." I had and have eyewitnesses to this. This short scene from my novel that I'm going to read is one between Mrs. Thatcher and Hitch, and it occurs on November 15, 1986. By this time, she is well into being prime minister, and she has just had a meeting with Ronald Reagan at Camp David, where she's told the president in no uncertain terms that she didn't like his flirtation with nuclear disarmament in Iceland at that Reykjavik summit. This Camp David meeting between Reagan and Thatcher did indeed happen, but what follows it in this scene, Mrs. Thatcher's press conference at the British Embassy back in Washington, and then her private encounter with Hitchens did not. This is entirely fictional, these few pages. November 15, 1986. As her helicopter entered the airspace of Northwest Washington, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher flicked a thistle from her camel hair coat. She had acquired the offending piece of vegetation several hours before while riding in a golf cart from the Camp David helipad to Aspen Lodge. During the afternoon, she had listened to Ronald Reagan deliver his weekly radio address and given him a severe talking to over lunch. Ambassador Ackland, sharing this return journey with her, would be taking the Prime Minister once they landed to a press conference at the British Embassy. Right now, however, he concentrated on picking up the thistle, which had landed near his shoe. As if it had been insufficiently punished, he deposited it in one of the helicopter's less and less used ashtrays. Mrs. Thatcher reached into her handbag for a copy of the communique that had been issued upon her departure from the president's weekend retreat. It stipulated that she and Reagan had, quote, confirmed that NATO's strategy of forward defense and flexible response would continue to require effective nuclear deterrence. The United States and the United Kingdom agree that these matters should continue to be the subject of close consultation within the alliance, unquote. We are pleased, said the Prime Minister, without looking up at the ambassador. 2 days after the collapse of last month's summit, she had called the president to request, or more nearly demand, today's meeting. She now believed that after his near-fatal slip on the utopian ice of Reykjavik, she had gotten Reagan back onto the solid ground of mutually assured destruction. Yes, said Ackland, who'd sifted through his briefcase for a copy of the communique. It's very sound. It ought to be, said Mrs. Thatcher. She had rehearsed her arguments to Reagan by trying them out yesterday on Schultz, the Secretary of State, and Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense, and had perfected them this morning over breakfast with Vice President George Bush. The helicopter began its descent. Within another few minutes, Ackland and the Prime Minister, her suit the same shade of blue as his own, were striding into the embassy's auditorium, taking up positions near a blown-up photo of Mrs. Thatcher and Reagan. It had been taken only hours ago during their golf cart gamble in the Catoctin Mountains and released to the press along with the communique. She had requested display of the enlargement because she knew the president's leather bomber jacket would infuriate the peacenik women still camped out back home in Greenham Common. After several questions about the language of the communique, the back and forth between the Prime Minister and the press grew more expansive. Prime Minister, have you at times been exasperated by the president's casual style and what's been described as his inattentiveness to detail? Mrs. Thatcher narrowed her nostrils. The president's broader brush reflects the differences between executive and parliamentary government. His grasp of essentials is quite acute. Over in Iceland, didn't the president nearly bargain away European security for unclear reasons of his own? And do you now have a sense of what those reasons were? The Prime Minister pointed her finger and shook it twice, slowly, like the blade of a scissors. Your second question is premised on your first. And since the answer to the first question is no, the second question is moot, and I needn't answer it. But I shall, in my own fashion. Before President Reagan came along, the West was losing the Cold War. With his election, as I said in a speech here in Washington in 1981, the tide began to turn. Bargain away European security? I think you'll find that the president drove a very hard bargain indeed. Just ask Mr. Gorbachev. Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada has long urged that we speak more softly to the Soviets. Is that advice not more urgent after the failure of the talks at Reykjavik? Mrs. Thatcher noticed, unbelievably enough, a second thistle that had managed to get underneath the camel hair coat and onto her navy blue skirt. She removed it without taking her eyes off the questioner. It was never urgent. We must speak firmly and must remember that nuclear weapons have given us over 4 decades more security, not less. The man from the Telegraph, seated in the front row, smiled as he wrote on his pad. He would bet that she had cuffed Reagan around something awful this afternoon, no matter that she was making it sound as if there'd never been a shade of disagreement between them. The writer sitting next to him, the chap he'd met over in Reykjavik last month, seemed to be thinking the same. Prime Minister, is it true, Christopher Hitchens now asked, that there was no note-taker at Camp David because the president knew you would get into a discussion of Iran? The Prime Minister prepared to mock the pseudo-knowingness of this question. which must be coming from The Guardian, or perhaps even worse, The New Statesman. The man asking it looked handsomely familiar, but she could not place him, a failure that she knew would drive her response to a higher level of irritability. Worse still, she realized that the question's presupposition was correct. She herself often relied on notes she dictated only after a meeting had finished, but Reagan, except for today, always had someone writing things down. She decided to execute a simple evasive maneuver. The president and I discussed, as always, anything we cared to. As for Iran, I believe implicitly in the president's total integrity on the subject. The Iran-Contra scandal is the newest of his troubles about to break. She looked at her watch. Nothing had really gone amiss, but she had ceased to enjoy herself and was ready to conclude things. I'm sorry my stay in the United States will be so short, and almost sorry that my welcome has been so warm. I find nothing more soothing than falling asleep to the chants of protesters in the middle distance. But there have been none to be found here. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Will you be leaving before breakfast tomorrow? After, I have requested my usual from the ambassador, vitamins and black coffee. Ackland gave two staffers the signal to wrap things up. The pair set about ushering the reporters out, and as they went, Mrs. Thatcher had another look at the dark-haired man in the front row, recognizing him this time. She had once, as leader of the opposition, swatted him on the rear end with a sheaf of papers. He waved hello, and then made a series of hand gestures to Ackland. Me? Her? Together? 2 minutes? Ackland signaled back, sorry, out of the question. No, said Mrs. Thatcher, noticing the dumb show and overruling the ambassador. It's all right. Rather astonished, Ackland arranged for Mr. Hitchens to stand with the Prime Minister on a carpet in a hall outside the library. Off the record, of course, he stipulated. Story of my life, said Hitchens. Pamela Harriman never goes on the record with him either. Yes, I do remember you, said Mrs. Thatcher. I even read you from time to time. I saw, for instance, what you wrote a week or so ago for The Spectator, quite colossally wrong. As if someone had taken the muddled thinking of the Foreign Office, turned it inside out, and managed to make it even more wrong. Hitchens was disappointed to notice that the teeth through which she was more or less smiling had been straightened since their last encounter. He found their improved arrangement to be a dash less arousing than when he'd seen her up close a decade ago, and she'd briefly disciplined him. Are you pleased, Prime Minister, that everything in arms negotiations with the President is allowed to depend on hypothetical laser beams? I'm quite in favor of SDI, Mr. Hitchens. I simply don't believe that it will or should make nuclear weapons obsolete. I'm delighted that the Soviets are so preoccupied by it, so desperate to stop it. If you did indeed read my piece, Prime Minister, you know what it says about a, quote, wasteful, dangerous militarization of space. Wasteful, perhaps, but an obliquely effective scheme for tilting the military balance back toward us. And yes, I shall continue my, quote, sub-Churchillian rhetoric about deterrence, as I believe you called it. Hitchens thought, who needs the jagged teeth? Was there any arousal equal to what came from being quoted to oneself? Mrs. Thatcher continued, in 1983, President Reagan told me that the Soviets would soon not be able to keep up the pace of the arms race, that their economic system wouldn't be up to it. He said the same thing again to me in 1984. We may actually be seeing that now. Build up to build down, said Hitchens. No, said the Prime Minister, build up to wear down. I am not in favor of discarding nuclear weapons within 10 years or 20, and that is not what the President proposed. Do you think he knows what he proposed? She stared at him more severely, as if he were an adolescent who just tried out a dirty joke. She would tolerate no talk of senescence or bewilderment. Met with silence, Hitchens continued speaking. Now that you've got this president back on the right path, are you prepared to deal with the next one? I discuss Mr. Reagan's political eclipse in my latest column. Perhaps I'll catch up with that one on the plane home. I'm sure it will prove useful. She slid her pocketbook up toward her elbow and waggled her empty hands. I'm afraid I'm unarmed today. She meant that she was carrying no roll of papers. It was thrilling that she remembered. Ackland led her toward the library, but before they entered it, she turned back around. Mr. Hitchens. Yes. Do you know any astronomy? I know that there's an observatory next door where Mr. Bush gets a free house. Go have a look through their telescope. You will be reminded that eclipses are, by definition, temporary. Thank you. We've got about 15 minutes. I'd be happy to take any questions about anything. Mrs. Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, Christopher Hitchens. I'd love to talk about Christopher Hitchens. Anybody at all?
Do you have a sense of the extent, if any, that symptoms of Alzheimer's started to take hold when Reagan was still president? And if so, do you have examples of ways that the administration dealt with it or tried to cover it up?
I would agree with Edmund Morris on this, and really most of Reagan's biographers, that Ronald Reagan had a fully functioning intelligence really for 3 years after he left the presidency. Morris talks about never seeing evidence of senescence in the president, but what he saw was a very tired man. By 1986, Reagan is 75, which was, even 30 years ago, a bit older to be in politics than it is now. I mean, if Joe Biden gets in, we'll have the 3 front-running Democratic candidates with a mean age of 70 plus. But it was considered getting up there for Reagan. And he, he was compromised by physical problems. He had been shot, had had a collapsed lung, had had a very serious cancer operation. So there's sort of signs that he's worn out. There are fleeting signs, in that diary that I mentioned, what even I, with myself, have already started to call senior moments. He's flying over a little mountain range between his Santa Barbara ranch and Los Angeles in August of '86, and he looks down and he can't remember the names of the mountains, which he's pointed out any number of times. I mean, the names of individual peaks, which he's pointed out to visitors on the helicopter. And it clearly rattles him. It rattles him enough to put it in the diary, which is usually not very personal anyway, but he's bothered by it. But I don't think the administration or the president himself was, compromised in any significant way. Somebody else? It's hard to see with the light. Yes.
Hi. Like you, I also very much enjoy Christopher Hitchens, and I'm sorry that he's gone. My question is, did he know that you were using him as the vehicle that you did in this book before he passed away, and what did he think about it? Or if not, what do you think he would think about it?
He did not. It may be rationalization, but I'm convinced he would have loved it. My previous novel, Watergate, was dedicated to Christopher. It came out just a couple of months after he died. He died in December of '11. The book came out 2 months later. He did see the dedication, and we talked about it. It was a very funny business to be putting him in here like that. And I miss Christopher on a daily basis. We disagreed on many, 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 many things, but he elevated life in Washington, socially, mentally, whatever. He was magic to be around, and was actually a very gentle, lovely person. For all of his ferocity and debate, there was a tremendous sweetness to him. But I was looking around there was a figure in the previous novel in Watergate, Alice Roosevelt Longworth, Teddy Roosevelt's ancient daughter. She was cracking 90 during the Watergate scandal, and she was kind of my one-woman witches chorus in that novel, who would offer wisecracking commentary on virtually everything. And I wanted somebody like that for this book. And to some extent, the older Nixon performs that function in this book. He's the commentator. But he he's also somewhat involved in the action. And I was sort of looking around and thinking and considering, and one day early on, it occurred to me, why not Hitchens? I didn't know Christopher at the time of this novel. I didn't know him until a decade later, even a little more than that. But once I started writing him, I realized how much I was enjoying writing him. Usually, if I sat and I thought very hard, within 15 minutes I could come up with a line half as funny as the kind he used to come up with at the dinner table, you know, spontaneously. And so it's impossible to say, and I hope he will forgive me if he doesn't like the idea, but the portrait of him is a very loving portrait, and tries to show him in all of his political complexity and personal warmth and generosity. I was always happy when I was writing a Hitchens scene, whenever I got to that. Yes?
Hi. Could you elaborate on the idea of Reagan being a more mysterious political figure than, say, Nixon? And do you think that if we had the sort of more personal tapes that we have with Nixon, then he would be less mysterious as a figure?
I think he'd be more mysterious, that Reagan would be more mysterious, actually, only because he would be unfailingly polite, genial, unprofane. I don't think he was mysterious as a politician. I mean, he was, as Mrs. Thatcher would say, he was a conviction politician. In fact, although he compromised a bit more than she had a taste for doing. But I think personally, there was something about him that held a part of himself back. Even when he was a young man and he was in Hollywood, people used to talk about the fact that when he would come onto a sound stage, no one would hear him. It was almost as if he glided onto it. There is, everybody talks about Reagan's optimism, and the extent of it was really kind of astonishing. All politicians like to call themselves optimists now. George W. Bush used to talk about himself as an optimist. Pessimism turns voters off. You know, Trump, it's going to be great. You're going to love it. It's going to be huge. Good times ahead. But his was a constant fact in his life. Again, in the diaries, if you read these diaries, he will often have a contentious, he'll have a meeting with somebody who has been beating up on him in public. Legislative opponent, an activist, somebody else comes into the Oval Office, they have a meeting, and, you know, and he's his genial self, and as soon as the meeting is over, they've left the White House and they're in front of a bank of reporters, and they're reaming him, you know, to the microphones. But Reagan in his diary says, you know, met for an hour with figure X, whatever. I think I made a friend. And that's how he operated, and an interesting way to operate. But I think in a way, tapes of Reagan might add to the mystery, because I think you would see all of his enormous social and personal skills, you know, operating with great smoothness and great manners. I don't think they'd be revealing. Right. Yes?
Really interesting that you mentioned Helen Caldicott, who I worked with in the past. She claimed to have gotten a meeting, a private meeting with Reagan because she met his daughter Patty Davis at a party at the Playboy Mansion. Is that true? That
yes.
She got a private meeting with no handlers in the White House to discuss the nuclear nonproliferation negotiations?
Right. Reagan's daughter Patty, who was far to the left of her father, as was his son, Ron Reagan. I mean, the only one of the president's children who was on the same page as he was politically was his first child, Maureen Reagan, who was his child with Jane Wyman. And Maureen Reagan was very fond of talking about how, you know, she'd become a Republican before her father had. In 1960, he was still undergoing his conversion. The meeting did happen. Helen Caldicott wrote a brutal account of it in one of her books, where she, I think with something of the benefit of hindsight, said that she did detect signs of senescence and so forth in the president. But he was, there was never going to be a meeting of the minds there. It somewhat surprises me that he consented to the meeting. I mean, Patty Davis, his daughter, must really have driven him crazy to grant it, because she had any number of beefs with him. I don't think, it was sufficiently tense, that meeting, that I don't think even he would have thought he made a friend after that one. But the historical opinion and contention about the nuclear freeze and whether Reagan's aggressive defense buildup ended the Cold War or not, I mean, is going to go on for a very long time. But in the years after Reagan left office, Dr. Caldicott I wouldn't say she was ever in retreat, but certainly her public image, her press image, her historical regard was lowering at a time his was rising. That may not be the final reckoning on that, but that's certainly what happened. Yes?
In what ways do you think fiction gets at truth better or different than history does?
It's an excellent question, and it lies at the heart of anything that I do. I don't write and don't read very much of what's called alternate history fiction, you know, where the South wins the Civil War or some big historical outcome has changed. I mean, my books, they track what Gore Vidal would call the agreed upon facts. It's not so much what might have happened instead as what might have happened in addition to something. And just two quick examples with this. You know, when you have a character who is a point of view character, like Nixon in Watergate and Nixon when he appears in this book. If you're a biographer, if you're Evan Thomas, whose biography of Nixon is very interesting to read, I know he's been at the festival today. If you're a biographer and you're wondering what Nixon thought at a certain moment when there was a turn of events, you have to hedge it with, at that moment, it is not implausible to think that Nixon might have thought this. If you're a novelist, you just go ahead and have him think it. And I think the chance to dramatize, to speculate, is something, it offers people an avenue in to history that they might not otherwise have. I'm always a little wary when people will say to me, occasionally people will say to me, oh, I've learned so much history from your books. And I always want to say, careful. Because a few years after writing each of them, there are a number of details where I would honestly have to go back to my notes to remember whether that was something I made up or something real. And so they don't violate the big things. But to go back to Trump as a verb, when I was talking about nouns and adjectives, you know, in that phrase, historical fiction, fiction is the noun. That's the word that wins. Historical fiction is always fiction. It's never history. But obviously, people read it because they're interested in history, and it offers them a speculative way in. It's a sliding scale. The degree to which you're willing to violate fact, that's going to vary from writer to writer. I would say, actually, most writers consider my historical fiction to be heavy on fact and verifiable fact. There are not many things that I will change around. But to speculate on what we might not know about, what might have happened in between the cracks of events, there's real opportunity there.
I mean, truth capital T is really hard. I mean, there's obviously many truths.
There's the literal truth,
and then there's the what really happened rather than
the truer truth.
Yeah, exactly.
In a way,
yeah.
And there's a sense that if you make up certain things for these real-life people, if you show them in certain situations, you might actually be learning things about them, understanding them in a way that you wouldn't if you were simply concentrating on what you knew had happened. And so it's a kind of speculative exercise, and more than anything else, an entertainment.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, I think one more question. Okay, and then wrap up.
Did Reagan hold any grudges? We know Nixon did.
Yes. It's hard to say. I don't. He was never publicly ugly with anybody. I do think that. I do think one thing that has been overrated, that has entered into kind of comforting political myth, is the Reagan-Tip O'Neill friendship. That, they would go out at hammer and tongs all day, and then at 5 o'clock, they'd have a beer and they'd become two genial Irishmen. I don't think either one liked the other at all. But I think that's different from holding a grudge. I mean, Reagan would, when people didn't agree with him, Reagan, it would perplex him why they didn't agree with him, which is a wonderful kind of confidence and serenity to have. How could they not agree with me? There are, I'm sure there are better examples than the O'Neill one, but I think that Reagan himself, as a political figure, certainly in the way he acted, he did not operate like a grudge keeper, even though he was in many ways, consumingly Irish. I mean, there's that joke, do you know what Irish Alzheimer's is? You remember only the grudges. He was very proud of his Irish temperament, but he did not have that scorekeeping aspect to him. Okay, having made a politically incorrect joke, I think I'm ready to wrap things up. Okay, thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.